Yogah Karmasu Kaushalam.
Let's move on to the next poet, and I would like to pick up here Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy reminds us of the great Renaissance figures, famous as he is for his prose, lyric verse and epic drama. The central theme of Hardy's poetry is the drama of human passion. He is deeply interested in nature, but it only forms a background to the human figures. To understand and appreciate Hardy's poetry, we must know something of his attitude to life. He had a most sympathetic mind, and it was permeated with the sadness that disturbs and even our happiest moments and the futility of our life on earth. He was bitterly disappointed with the imperfections of the world, and out of his emotional protests, he created a world of his own where all protest is valueless. It would be bearable to think that consciously malignant power was the cause of all our woes, but these purblind doomsters had already strewn blisses about my pilgrimage as pain, as he said. The range and scope of Hardy's sight and insight are apparent by the titles of his volumes of verse. They are headed satires of circumstances, moments of vision, times, laughing stocks, Wessex poems, human shows. There is the dying man who overhears his wife ordering new clothes soon to be required for a widow of latest fashion. The Bible class girl, after moving sermon, sees the preacher, her idol, reenacting his pulpit gestures in the Wesley mirror with a satisfied smile. It will be wrong to say that Hardy had no sense of humor, but we must admit that Hardy takes inevitable moods a little too seriously. We might take the poem At Waking, for instance. The lover suddenly realizes that his mistress is but an ordinary woman. She seemed but a sample of earth's poor average kind, lit up by no ample enrichments of main and mind. Now for a word about the dynasts. The book has an infinite variety, vast sweep, mighty speed and poetic unity. It is a great tragedy, but it is free from all bitterness and crossness which peeps out here and there in the novels. Like all great tragedies, it is cathartic. If it leaves no room for hope, at least it excludes despair, and the closing note is almost hopeful. But a stirring thrills the ear like to sounds of joyance there, that the rages of the ages shall be cancelled, and deliverance offered from the darts that were consciousness the will informing, till it fashions all things of air. Moving now to W.H. Davies. Davies writes himself, this Davies has no depth. He writes of birds, of stirring cows and sheep, and throws no light on deep eternal things. Well, generally speaking, this is also the verdict of the world on his poetry. It is so simple and artless that it astonishes us by its naivete. But in reality, Davies is a poet of extreme accomplishment and sophistication, which he hides by a deceptive aura of simplicity all the time. He is sensible to the menace of the dark wing that life spreads upon creatures. When I am in those great places, I see 10,000 suffering faces. Before me stares a wolfish eye, behind me creeps a groan and sigh. This is how he depicts. The best poems of Davies can be found in his collected poems and 40 new pieces. His themes are fairly varied. Besides nature poems, he has written poems on infancy, children, friends, death, sickness, poetry, money, eating and drinking, sleep, sailors, music, religion, love, and other topics. His love for nature is deep and sincere. Just like in these lines, a rainbow and a cuckoo, Lord, how rich and fine the times are now. Again, in the same poem, he says, a rainbow and a cuckoo's song may never come together again, may never come this side of the tomb. Davies is not, however, oblivious to the miseries of life. He thinks and feels deeply for the unemployed and poor children. He cannot view without finding tragedy lurking behind them, for example, the blind child and the little ones. When he goes into the woods, he heaves a sigh of relief to have escaped from all the misery that can be witnessed in large cities. He says, I quote, "This life is sweetest in this wood. I hear no children cry for food. I see no woman white with carp, no man with muscles wasting there." Another poet who made up his mark in the list of modern poetry I must quote here is Walter de la Mare. Walter de la Mare might be styled the laureate of the fairy world. He possesses the charming gift of fantasy and can give expression to it in haunting subtle melody. Walter de la Mare is known to many as the writer of pretty poetry for the nursery. It is true he wrote a few volumes for children, for example, Songs for Children and Peacock Pie, and then edited a beautiful anthology for the young of all ages, Come Hither, but this is a very inadequate view of his poetry. In a poem, Hide and Seek, he says, and I quote, "Hide and seek, say I, to myself, and step out of the dream of wake into the dream of sleep." His style poetry possesses an astonishing variety. It contains nursery rhymes, stories and songs at some beautiful period. He captures the moods of childhood and recreates the prattle of children. Walter de la Mare did not believe in distinction between the real and unreal. Their charm lies in the suggestiveness of something weird and uncanny. We can take one example, the mocking fairy. I quote, "Won't you look out of your window, Mrs. Gill?" Quoth the fairy, nodding in the garden. "Can't you look out of your window, Mrs. Gill?" quoth the fairy, laughing softly in the garden. But the air was still, the cherry boughs were still, and the ivy beneath the empty sill, and never from the window looked out Mrs. Gill on the fairy shrilly mocking in the garden. Unquote. There are elegies scattered all over his works, as for example the epitaph. But there is one consolation. Though he knows that beauty vanishes, beauty passes, however rare it be, the single individual is drowned in a flowing stream of consciousness. I quote, "Oh, when this dust surrender hand, foot, lip to dust again, may these loved and loving faces please another men." Unquote. Deeply stirred by the silence that pervades the world at dawn and dusk, there, when the dusk is falling, silence broods so deep It seems that every wind that breathes blows from the fields of sleep. This brings me to another poet, very famous modern poet who has been included in various curricula, lists of poets, anthologies, known for his mysticism, known for him being a precursor of the Irish poetry movement. Yes, we come down to W.B. Yeats. Yeats laid the foundations of Irish literary movement in collaboration with Lady Gregory Saint and others we all know. He wrote two fine poetic dramas, The Countess Kathleen and The Land of Heart's Desire. His most popular collections were lyrics, they were poems, and The Wind Among the Reeds. Then he continued to produce lyrics as well as plays after 1905 and 1901, and his later poems show an increase of poetic power and a deepening of intellectual quality. He is a fastidious poet, writing little, revising many often. As a consequence, the average merit of his poetry is high. He is a great artist, and his mastery of technique is seen in such perfect lyric as The Lake Isle of Innisfree, When You Are Old, The Sorrow of Love, Down by the Salley Gardens, The Fiddler of Dooley, and A Dream of Death. What is said about Innisfree poem, I quote, "Few modern poems can have had so much artistry lavished on them as the Lake Isle of Innisfree." Unquote. He might be likened to the human child led away by fairies of whom he speaks in The Stolen Child. Away with us he is going, the solemn-eyed, away from a world more full of weeping than he can understand. Unquote. In the second poem, he leaves the familiar earth and weaves a magnificent tapestry, borrowing all the colors of the heavens. But the atmosphere is too rarefied. He himself warns us, quote, "I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread lightly, because you tread on my dreams." Unquote. In his later years, Yeats moved more and more outside his world of fairy and came into closer contact with reality. In poem of his middle period, he said, I quote, "I am worn out with dreams." Unquote. A memorable fragment of self-criticism. Indeed, he must have thoroughly wearied of being cited as the poet of the Lake Isle of Innisfree, as he realized that the time has come when, I quote, "things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world." Unquote. Yeats believed that, quote again, "all men will more and more reject the opinion that poetry is a criticism of life and be more and more convinced that it is the revelation of a hidden life." Unquote. This remark helps to explain the presence of symbolism and mysticism in his poetry. But he was broad-minded enough to have both sympathy and understanding for the younger generation. The younger generation of poets whose ideals were so different from those of his own youth. This can be seen in the preface he wrote to the Oxford Book of Modern Verse. In the poems of his last years, the vigor of his mind and senses is unimpaired, and it is in revolt against the enfeeblement of his body. He progresses as a lyrical poet, might be gauged from a comparison of the Innisfree poem with the more complex one, Byzantium, published in 1930. It was the harder quality of beauty in his poems of the last phase that aligned him with the poets of the new age. Yeats gave a new mythology to English poetry, the Celtic. His style also has the usual Celtic peculiarities, a meditative and melancholy beauty, a misty idealism, and a sweet and dignified diction. So, would like to move to another poet, A. E. Housman. Two slim volumes of verse comprise the poetry of A. E. Housman. In 1896, a Shropshire lad published, without any mystical gloss or romantic flavor, everything about his poems except their length is bewitching and uneasy. He shirks all responsibility of a teacher because he finds himself in an alien world, subject to laws he never made, I, a stranger, and afraid in a world T never made. And how bitterly disappointed is he with the world, I quote, the stinging gnattle only will still be found to stand, unquote. Three themes can easily be distinguished in his poems: soldier's hip, love, and the gallows. I quote, his folly hath no fellow beneath the blue of day that gives to man or woman his heart and soul away, unquote. Love is connected irretrievably with the end. I quote again, lovers lying two and two, ask not whom they sleep besides, and the bridegroom all night through never turns him to the bride, unquote. Friendship, however, was a passion with Housman. On the battlefield, lifelong friendships are formed between man and woman, woman and woman. In youthful language, he speaks of the friends he has lost. I quote, with rue my heart is laden, for golden friends I had, for many a rose-lipped maiden and many a light-foot lad, unquote. Housman stands perfectly alone. No one has written like him. No one has dared to take up such an independent position. Housman presumes to judge God and to find him wanting. Housman brushes aside all conceptions of God, spirit of universe, spirit of beauty, and such other subjects. There is no universal spirit which our spirits can commune, he thought about. He cannot, as other great poets have done, help others to find peace. A scathing bit of criticism may be applied to him. I quote, he sees life as it is and proceeds to make it a great deal worse, unquote. The poet's splendid intellect, his superb literacy economy, the word magic, the great simple beauty of his poems make us love and admire his art. But we cannot run away from devastating fact that there is no moral in his poetry. We do expect a great poet to give us some meaning of life and nature, but after going through his poems with breathless enthusiasm, we remain where we began. Endowed as he was with a mind of piercing clarity, he has made nothing of the enigma himself, and Housman's poems are themselves magnificent edifices, hewn in rock, but his thoughts have no stability.